Hi there, welcome along to the first edition of Marshall's World of Sports show, which is basically a podcast where we talk about everything that's happening in and around the world of sport. Today, we're going to be having a football conversation looking at South African football, the state of South African football, looking at our national team, Bafana Bafana, as well as the DStv Premiership. And there's no better person to have that conversation with than someone who's been involved in the game in South Africa for a couple of decades now, and that is Mr. Mike Makaab. Mike, good to have you.
Thanks very much. Wonderful to be here, and it's interesting times in South African football.
Very, very interesting times. And I also have my co-host, that is Mr. Ntobeko Mbambo, is also involved in Marshall's World of Sports. Marquez.
How's it, brother?
Hi.
It feels good to be here, and it feels good to have you back.
Very good to be here, my brother. And obviously, it is a long, winding conversation, a very nuanced conversation, Mike. And I'm going to bring you in here because of the context. We're just coming from a Soweto derby this weekend. We saw Pirates and Chiefs, a last-minute win for Kaizer Chiefs, a penalty at the end there. What did you make, firstly, of that game before we get into the state of where both teams are right now?
To be very honest with you, if I look at glimpses of the derby, it excited me. It brought back some fantastic memories. But if I have to look at it overall, I must say it was disappointing as a spectacle. And again, I don't think that we have to underestimate the difference that a packed stadium makes to a big game like the one between Chiefs and Pirates. We've seen it worldwide now with the mere fact that spectators are allowed back. Let's just use the English Premiership as an example. They're allowed back into the stadium in full force, and the atmosphere just generates something different. And I think it seems to squeeze the last ounce of energy out of players. You speak to football players and ask them how difficult it is to play behind closed doors worldwide, and they'll tell you it's never the same.
Mike, obviously looking at some of the biggest talking points, during the match, Kaizer Chiefs smashing great victory with Keegan Dolly converting the penalty.
Yes.
But there's a lot of controversial stuff. I mean, some people kind of feel as if that wasn't really a clear-cut penalty. So many people on social media believing that wasn't a penalty. Maybe just your thoughts.
Okay, so it's, again, very easy when you've had the hindsight of looking at replays in slow motion, super slow motion from different angles. But don't forget that the referee and his assistant, they don't have the luxury of VAR. So they've got to make spontaneous decisions. Some decisions are correct, some decisions in hindsight aren't correct. But I thought, if I can go back to the first shout for penalty, and that was the handball, Tyson's handball. The hands were away from the body, definitely changed the direction of the ball and prevented the momentum in an attack. I felt that was a penalty. I felt that the second penalty was debatable. Let me take you through it, and why I'm saying that is Ndar challenged for the ball, no challenge from Billiat. Billiat's a smart operator and he's a professional, and hats off to him. He leaned into Ndar, little bit of a push on Ndar, which pushed Ndar slightly sideways. Ndar overemphasized his correction of his fall by grabbing Billiat around the neck, and then Billiat, I believe, milked it by falling backwards. For me, in hindsight, and having had the luxury of re-looking at it a number of times, I thought it was what I would call a soft penalty, and I've created controversy on my social media account by saying that. But I stick to my guns. I thought that the first one was a definite penalty, and I thought that the second one was debatable.
Yeah, and obviously now with that win, it takes Chiefs above Sundowns, above Pirates in terms of the log standings. And looking at where both teams are right now, the state of the Soweto Giants, I mean, you coached Pirates a long time ago.
Yes.
Where would you say the teams are? Obviously, we can all see that they're far off the pack in terms of where Sundowns is. And obviously, Mike, the win for Kaizer Chiefs did take him above Pirates in terms of where they are on the log standings, but they're still pretty much far off in terms of where Sundowns is right now. So just your own assessment of where both teams are at the moment. You coached Pirates before. They're not really where they were. If you look at the likes of, if you go back to 2010 when they won the double treble. So what would you attribute this to? Why are these two Soweto Giants so far off the pace right now?
No, it's it's almost a one-phrase question which should have a simple answer, but we all know football is complex and it doesn't have a simple answer. I have my theories. First and foremost, worldwide, financial strength amongst the football clubs has changed the landscape of football, and that's globally.
Yeah.
We've seen what Manchester City have been able to do with a big checkbook. We've also seen the likes of Real Madrid and Barcelona up until last season dominate La Liga. Juventus dominating Italian football for so many seasons. And now Mamelodi Sundowns, without a doubt, by far the most successful football club in South Africa in modern PSL history. I think that football is cyclical, irrespective of the size of the checkbook, irrespective of the quality of staff that you have in the building, and that goes both on the technical side and playing side. Things will change. We saw Liverpool have an amazing 2 years and then Man City unseat them again. Yesterday we saw Liverpool losing 3-2 to West Ham United in an incredible game of football. So things change. Football is dynamic. If you look at the double treble team of Orlando Pirates, probably one of the most well-balanced Orlando Pirates teams I've seen put together since 94-95, when Pirates won the league and became champions of Africa.
When you won the league, Mike.
And if you look at the Kaizer Chiefs side under Stuart Baxter, 2 years in a row, a very well-balanced team, a young Bernard Parker, Tsepo Masilela, and we can go on forever in terms of the quality of player and the depth of the squad and the quality of the depth of the squad. Then it boils down to the coach's changes in both teams and trying to find the right match for the culture of the club. And one has to hope that clubs like Chiefs and Pirates understand what their vision is, what their culture is, what their story telling is, and they've got to stay true to that. A little bit of deviation here and there to make changes for the change in football. But outside of all of that, I think it's absolutely vital that you find a coach and a technical staff that matches your vision and your culture, and a group of players that can deliver on that. And that's easier said than done, irrespective of how much money you have to spend. And I think it will take time for both teams to find that sweet spot again. One can only hope that once they have found the sweet spot, that their succession plan, both on the technical side of the game and on the playing side of the game, is one that makes the transition a little bit more seamless than it has been since Baxter left Chiefs and Pirates won the double treble.
Mike, obviously Sundowns have been the dominant force of South African football for like a decade or so now. What can you attribute to the Brazilians' success? I mean, if you look at them, Chiefs and Pirates are struggling to obviously compete with Sundowns in terms of winning trophies. But what can you attribute to their success?
I think that Patrice Motsepe's introduction into South African football has changed the landscape. He obviously has great leadership qualities. He's an ambitious businessman, and although he doesn't, openly say that Mamelodi Sundowns is a business, I believe that it is a business, and he has to look at it in a certain way from a business point of view, and he's a great businessman. He also, has plowed a lot of money into the club. He's been, hasn't been shy to change things when they've had to, to be changed. And he's adopted the model that the big clubs throughout the world have adopted. They sign what they believe are the best players, and those that don't fit immediately into their plans, they loan out. We've seen it happen with Chelsea, with Manchester City, with all the top clubs worldwide. So he's adopted that model. And I must say, Mamelodi Sundowns have started to produce some interesting players from their development structure. So great leadership, big ambition. The president wants Mamelodi Sundowns to be the biggest club on the African continent. At the moment, they lag far behind Al Ahly and a few others in terms of the trophies that they've won continentally. They're dominating South African football. and probably will do so for many years to come unless something changes drastically. But it's the ambition, I would think, of the leadership that is driving Sundowns.
And just back on the conversation of Kaizer Chiefs, obviously we were in a world of social media right now, a different age. You on social media yourself, so you know what goes on there and what the fans really say. And a lot of fans in South Africa are very vocal, especially Kaizer Chiefs fans being the most supported club in the country. And a lot of them have accused you for the longest time. I mean, you can even go back years before of the recent downfall of the team in terms of you're a player agent, you're responsible for a lot of prominent players, and the fans basically bashing you for not providing the support for Kaizer Chiefs in terms of giving them the right players. I mean, how have you dealt with something like that over the years, and most recently right now with where Kaizer Chiefs is?
First and foremost, it's important for them to understand I love them. Because the dynamic of South African football wouldn't be as exciting as it is without our supporters. Probably amongst the most colourful supporters in the world. So there is nothing personal, and that I can assure you. The second thing is, I would not be on social media, and I wouldn't open myself as vulnerably as I do on social media if I didn't enjoy a healthy debate with those that count. And for me, those that count are the foot soldiers who are our supporters. And so it's wonderful for me to have an opportunity to interact with them, and they appreciate it. And the only time that I will refuse to continue a debate if it becomes personal and insulting. Nothing upsets me more than poor language used against football players of any level, irrespective of whether we represent those players or not. It upsets me, and I won't deal with people like that. I won't interact with people like that. But for the main part, I have a wonderful relationship with Kaizer Chiefs supporters. You can call it a love-hate relationship. It's what drives our conversation. And a lot of them understand that there will always be fanatical supporters that will accuse every single person who they deem to be an opponent to Kaizer Chiefs of doing the wrong thing. Definitely not the case. I've offered Chiefs some of the top talent and continue to do so, and have done so for many, many years. It's incredibly difficult. I know that we off air spoke about Sibusiso Vilakazi. It's extremely difficult for me to force the hand of any football club to pay a transfer fee that is demanded by the selling club.
100%.
And it's incredibly difficult for me to convince a player, although it does happen, to accept a lesser income based on the longevity of that player's career. If I truly believe that a football player would be better off playing at a certain football club because of the longevity of his career and it being the right step from a position point of view, from the ability to build a career at that particular club, I will do my utmost to convince that player to accept the deal as opposed to look at the more lucrative financial deal. I'm going to go way back to Siyabonga Nomveti. Siyabonga was my first client, playing for African Wanderers, and the big three were chasing after him. Don't forget, at that point in time, Orlando Pirates had already signed Pumlani Mkhize and Sibusiso Rizuma. And the last of the big three was Siyabonga Nomveti. As you know, they played the three up front for African Wanderers. I don't think there's been a better and more interesting strike force in the history of South African football, to be honest with you. And one wonders what would have happened if the three stayed together. But Siyabonga was made an offer by Orlando Pirates, by Kaizer Chiefs, and by Mamelodi Sundowns. Don't forget, I had only recently coached Orlando Pirates. So I ended my coaching stint with them in 95, and I'd become an agent in 98. So it was 3 years later. And the worst of the three offers in terms of finance was Kaizer Chiefs. It hasn't always been that way. The best was Mamelodi Sundowns. Even in those days, it was the checklists that were in charge of Sundowns. And Pirates were somewhere in between. Sat down with Nomveti and we analysed the three teams, and we looked at the fact that Pirates had already signed a number of strikers. Mamelodi Sundowns had some prolific strikers, including the Masingas, the late Phil and Bennett.
Yeah.
Kaizer Chiefs had a top-class 9 called Colin and Lamia.
Yeah.
And I felt that his physical presence and the way he played deep in the box, the way he liked to hold the ball up, suited Siyabonga Nomvethi's style of play more than anything.
Yeah.
And so we decided that Nomvethi would sign for Chiefs. And the rest is history. After his first short season, became player of the year, top goal scorer of the year. And in the following season was the first player we placed in Italy. Or the first player we placed in Europe at Udinese. So there's a typical example of not making a decision based on finance.
100%. Mike, I'm going to take you back to the Sibusiso Vilakazi transfer. I
Yes.
remember at some point, Sundowns and Chiefs were going toe-to-toe for his signature. You know, and based on media reports, it looked as if he was heading to Kaizer Chiefs. But
Yes.
unfortunately, it never happened. He ended up at Sundowns. But in that situation, was it a case of a better offer from Sundowns or a better environment from Sundowns, obviously, to prolong his career?
No, I think there was absolutely no difference in the two environments. It was clear that Sundowns wanted him to come in as a starting player.
Yeah.
It was also clear that Kaizer Chiefs wanted him to come in as a starting player, although nothing can be guaranteed in
Yeah,
football.
100%.
In terms of the offer to the player himself, I can categorically state that there was very little difference
Yeah.
between the two clubs. The big difference was the fact that Bidvest Wits demanded a certain
Yeah.
transfer fee, and at the end of it all, the only team that was prepared to pay that was Mamelodi Sundowns. And again, how do I force the issue? How do I go across to Wits and say, I'm sorry, Vilakazi is not going to Sundowns? When Vilakazi himself didn't have a real preference. He might have slightly wanted to go to Chiefs at one stage and then slightly wanted to go to Sundowns at another stage. But truth be told, he wanted the move. He felt it was the right time in his career, and we agreed with him. And the team that came up with the money in terms of the transfer was Mamelodi Sundowns.
Just on the last one, Mike, with regards to Kaizer Chiefs, I think closing that one now, looking at one of your clients there, which is Bernard Parker. You know, I think he's been at Chiefs now for over a decade, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Recently became the all-time leading scorer in the PSL era for Chiefs. So he's been there for quite a long time, won trophies, you know. But recently, he's been a scapegoat, in particular for the poor performances at Chiefs, being one of the most experienced players at the side there. And I think even recently we saw him against SuperSport United. He got a brace. But after the match, in his interview, he got very emotional, you know, about the whole moment. And, you know, one could really pick up that he's probably is feeling the strain from all of that right now. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But how do you deal with players in that kind of situation where they're having it really hard with fans, with stakeholders, even with the club itself? So how do you deal with that? And in this case, in Bernard Parker, how do you deal with him, or what have you said to him?
Okay, so firstly, I think, sadly, in South African football, this is not an uncommon thing. We go back to the late Phil Masinga. He became the target of the Blue Boys when he played for Bafana. And then when he scored vital goals, he became a hero. But they always seem to have gone back to not disliking him, but using him, as you used the word, a scapegoat. We had the same thing with Tamsanka Gabuza at Orlando Pirates, and now recently with Bernard Parker. It's a sad situation because players like Bernard Parker deserve to be treated with the respect that they yearn for from fans and supporters. Don't believe for one moment that being a professional footballer takes away the fact that you flesh and blood, and that you do feel hurt when the people that are supposed to be supporting you openly talk poorly about you, particularly on social media. And social media has created this.
Yeah.
It's created this opportunity for everybody to publicize their opinion about any matter at all. Freedom of speech. And whilst I accept that, you know, everybody is entitled to an opinion, it's the way you portray yourself in delivering that opinion that tells me about you as a person. In terms of Bernard, he's a thorough professional. Bernard has never asked, not once, for his contract to be extended at Kaizer Chiefs. Neither have I. Kaizer Chiefs have come to me on each and every single occasion, and I've waited until they've come across to me, and I haven't put them under any pressure. And we all know in South African football, in world football, 6 months prior to the end of a football player's contract, he's a free agent, and he can sign his new deal with any football club that he wishes to without engaging his club. Mm. So in this instance, it would have been very easy for me to engage with Chiefs in January, this past January, on Bernard Parker, which we never did. We waited right until the end, until we understood what Kaizer Chiefs wanted to do. Yeah. And it's helped a great deal that Stuart is back. Yeah. Although Gavin had great faith in Bernard, but it's helped a great deal because Stuart is a smart football manager. He realizes that it's one thing bringing good young players through, and by the way, Chiefs have brought a number of good young players through, but it's another thing surrounding them with wise old heads for experience, both on the training field and in the dressing room, and then on match day. Whether that player is playing or not playing, the presence in the dressing room sometimes makes a massive difference to calming the nerves, and particularly in big games like the derby. So Bernard has always had our support. He's a wonderful character. He's a top-class professional, great family man, and that's all we'll ever do. We'll give Bernard and anybody else whom we represent the sort of support that they deserve. One thing I can tell you is we'll never protect a player if the player is wrong. Yes, of course we'll protect him in trying to assist him through the process of overcoming the difficulties of maybe self-creation of problems and the way forward. But in the case of Bernard, he's got our undying support because he's a club man. Ultimately he wants to coach at the club.
100%. Mike, crossing over to the national team, obviously international break is coming up.
Yes.
What have you made of the new coach, Hugo Broos, and the start he has made with Bafana Bafana?
Very confident man, single-minded, understands what he wants to achieve. I think what he's done really well is he's put together a group of players that not necessarily may be the most informed or talented players in the country, but he's put together a group of players that he believes will play for the badge, and that he believes will play within his system and his understanding of the way he wants the game played. He did a similar thing with Cameroon. And as I said, very single-minded, and he's an artist when it comes to dealing with the media and getting his message across to the South African public.
Yeah, and in terms of the squad itself, we've seen a different approach, as you mentioned. It's almost like an overhaul, because the older squad with Coach Molefi Ntsegi was almost dismantled entirely. The more experienced players got a new captain. Thulani Hlatshwayo was out. So what have you made of that in particular? And there are also people who are crying out to basically say that he needs to include more experienced players within the side with the youngsters that are there. So what do you make of that, and what do you think of the shift that is made? Even he made it as soon as he arrived.
I admire his shift because it takes a brave man to do that, and somebody who believes in his own system and ability. So that's admirable. We all have differing opinions, and I'm now going to put a football coach's cap on and not a football agent's cap on. To say that in my instance, would I have completely overhauled the team? No. Would I have made significant changes? Yes. You needed fresh impetus. Would I have included certain experienced players that are in top form? Most definitely, because I think as the challenge becomes more difficult, and I'm not saying that we haven't gone through a difficult challenge already, and we've done really well with that, but it's going to become more difficult. Playing Ghana away. We're having to play Zimbabwe, who are almost
down and out.
They're down and out, but they understand South African football probably better than any other because there's so many of them playing in our league. So it doesn't matter, where their form is. They're going to be stiff opposition for us. So as the challenge gets a little bit more difficult, I think you've got to start looking at players that could give you the X factor. I'm thrilled that he's brought Keegan Dolly into the fray, because I think Keegan's been remarkable in his last month or so for Kaizer Chiefs. I'm thrilled for that. I think there are one or two other players that I would have brought in. I don't want to mention names. But I honestly believe that Hugo Broos and his technical team have to be applauded. They've done a good job.
Ross has exposed a lot of things in South African football. What do you make of his no-nonsense approach? Because, he's just stepping on people's toes, and that's like his character.
Okay, very difficult for me to talk about the toes that he stepped on, other than the comment he made about agents. When he said a number of agents phone him and ask him to have a cup of coffee with him, to try and talk to him about and influence player selection. It's always sad when you make a general statement like that. If you want to make a statement like that, then make a statement which says, by the way, Orlando Pirates refused me entry into the stadium. I have a little bit of beef with the way Rolani Mokoena had certain things to say about me. Say it out straight. Mention names and say it out straight. Don't categorize agents into one basket. Name and shame. So I received a phone call from Mike Makaab, and Mike was trying to influence me to play a certain player, and I'll mention the player's name. Rather do it that way than generalize. And that's the only beef that I have with Hugo Broos, is that when you make a blanket statement like that, you've got to back it up with fact and evidence.
I think just on that conversation, obviously it's probably one of the oldest conversations we've had in South African football when it comes to Bafana Bafana, the influence of agents within the national team. I think at one point around 2013, you were also sort of like implicated in that,
Definitely.
but you got cleared by SAFA. I think you were at the committee there and everything was cleared out. What do you make of comments like that, and how big is your influence? I think I need you to be honest with this one.
Absolutely.
How do agents influence, or do they have influence when it comes to the national team?
First and foremost, they shouldn't have. And I'm talking about a general statement I'm making. What are you talking about in South Africa? Nothing could be further from what should happen in terms of an agent's role in representing a player than him having an influence on national team selection. Sadly happens in many countries throughout the world, particularly at junior level, and we can all guess why, and rather let's not go into that discussion. But I can tell you that if that is the case and there is evidence, then that person involved should be banned from involvement in football for a sizable or a lengthy period of time. Exactly the same as you would look at a bribe in football at any level. You need to be looking at something like this, in that same vein. In terms of the allegations made against me, it was one football player, a player called Thabo Ntete, happened to captain Bloem Celtic. It was a sad state of affairs because it was one journalist and one journalist only, a white journalist, no names mentioned, that had a hidden agenda. And I wish I could tell you what that hidden agenda was, but I won't. He had this opinion that Thabo Ntete wasn't good enough to play in the national team, and the only reason that he was in the national team was because of the fact that I represented Gordon Egerson, and I influenced Gordon to select him because he had a contract with a big corporate, and part of the contract with a big corporate was that he had to play for Bafana Bafana. Nothing could have been further from the truth. And I publicly went on record stating that I would welcome SAFA or any other body to bring me before a committee or a tribunal or a truth commission and put me on a hot seat. let me take a lie detector test, whatever you wanted me to do. It didn't even have to happen because it was cleared by Danny Jordan, publicly cleared. It's something that I would never do. I've been in this industry for 23 years. You don't build a company like Prosport on whims and fancies.
Yeah.
You don't build them on a pack of cards, a company like this. I've got many players that I believe should be playing for the national team. I'll tell you the one that I believe at the time surprised me, and his omission from the team surprised me, Rivaldo Kutsia. But it wasn't only me that it surprised many people.
Yeah.
I think that the one thing that I would never do, particularly with a coach that I represent, Mangoba and Beat, Mangoba will tell you, I have never once picked up the phone and ever spoken to him about a player we represent, or any coach for that matter. In actual fact, what will happen once in a while, even coaches that I don't represent, I'll get a phone call from a coach to say, Mike, you have a player that is represented at our football club, and his behavior off the field is not good. I'd like you to talk to him, or I'd like you to get into his head and find out why he's not giving me what he gave to his previous club. And that's as far as it goes.
Mike, obviously, you became the first FIFA accredited agent in the country back in the days. I mean, what challenges did you encounter initially? Because obviously at that time, it was alien to have agents in South Africa.
I was treated as an alien. Literally.
Yeah.
It was difficult because it was something that was totally unknown in our football. It was uncharted territory for not only myself, but for football administrators, football players, everybody involved in football. And for a long period of time, I was the only FIFA licensed agent. It was tough.
Yeah.
It was tough. And the crazy thing is, within 12 months of me opening the company, we represented close to 100. In those days, it wasn't the PSL, it was the NFL. National Football League, the top league was the NFL in those days. We represented over 100 players.
It's massive.
It was massive. Thankfully, things have changed, and there are a number of good agents in the business, and so we still represent a lot of players. We represent about 140 players, but not all of them in the PSL. So it was difficult. I think what helped me through the journey was the fact that I had come off coaching in the let's call it the PSL, and that my honesty and transparency and my credibility in the industry was built as a football coach, and so it was a little bit easier for football administrators and football bosses to accept me and the new role that I was going to play in the game. But it was a tough period.
This might be a very tough question for you,
Yes.
but I'm pretty sure you have something at the back of your mind. The biggest deal that you've brokered, specifically looking at the players that you've sent to Europe.
Well, there are so many. We were looking at it the other day, African players in Europe. Close to 200 deals we've done for African football players from the continent into Europe.
Sure.
The majority from this country. And there was a time where we were placing 4, 5, 6 players in the season in different leagues throughout the world. Big 5 plus leagues like Russia, Belgium, Greece, etc. When you ask me the biggest deal, let me rather break it into a few different categories. The biggest financial deal, in terms of transfer fee, Collins and Basuma, if I look at real terms. So I have to go back and try and think, what would that money be worth today? Collins and Basuma.
It's Blackburn, right?
No, to Portsmouth.
Oh, Portsmouth, sorry.
And Portsmouth were in the EPL.
Yeah, Premier League at that time.
He made his debut within a couple of weeks, almost scored as a substitute. That was the biggest financial deal. And the biggest deal, still to this day, in terms of emotion, would be Siyabonga Nomveti from Kaizer Chiefs to Udinese.
Was that because it was the first one?
Yes, and also because Bele has been with me since. I mean, we're still together today. So emotionally, that would have been a big deal for us. In terms of the biggest deal, directly from Africa into a big club in a big league in Europe, OJ Mabizela,
Tottenham.
to Tottenham Hotspurs, at the age of 22. And he didn't go there as a squad player. He went there as a starter. And so that was exciting times. Daniel Levy was, in those days, the chairman, so he was a young Daniel Levy. Glenn Hoddle was manager and Chris Hughton was assistant manager. So probably those three deals. But then Tsepa Masilela played in La Liga. Nassif Morris played in La Liga. KG, Kahisho Dikashwa, played for Fulham in the EPL. And I'm only talking about African players. Yorgos Karagounis, captain of Greece, legendary player. We signed at Fulham. Just recently, Tsimikas to Liverpool through Prosport in Greece. So there have been big deals, but I would say emotionally, Nomvete, financially, Mbasuma, and in terms of stature, OJ.
Mike, I mean, let's focus on OJ. In my opinion, I think it's probably the best defender the country has ever produced. And I remember he once played a game for Spurs against Man United, and he totally outclassed Cristiano Ronaldo in that game. Just talk us through his stint at Spurs.
So, when Spurs came to South Africa, the one player that Glenn Hoddle identified was Mabizela, and he spoke to the chairman, Dr. Khoza, and said to the chairman that he would like to take him back with him on trial. And the chairman said, no problem. And that's one thing where the chairman is often misunderstood. He's never stood in the way of progress of his football players. Seen it with him. I took Vilakazi into Denmark. That was So Vilakazi. And the late Leslie Manyatela. In actual fact, I was getting off the plane in London to meet up with Spurs when I had a message left on my mobile phone by the chairman to say, unfortunately, Leslie Manyatela has met with an accident and he's passed away. That was as my feet touched the ground at Heathrow. That was the news I received. So you can imagine the heartache. Leslie was on his way to Olympic Lyon. But the heartache for his family and for the South African football fraternity at the time when we were doing this deal for Mabizela. So I watched Mabizela play in his final trial game. It was against Sporting Lisbon at White Hart Lane, packed house. Glenn Hoddle played three at the back. Mabizela played on the right of the three. Sporting Lisbon played three up. Cristiano Ronaldo played on the left.
This was pre-season, right?
Of the three. Cristiano Ronaldo signed for Manchester United. He had an enormous game against Ronaldo when he played for Sporting Lisbon. 10 minutes from the end, left the field to a standing ovation from the Spurs crowd. And the following day we finalised the deal. So we opened an office in London purely to take care of Mabizela because he was a national treasure. That's what we thought. And he was a very important client to Prosport and a very important football player in the history of our country. And I thought he was honestly destined for greatness. Carlos Queiroz said it. Don't ask me. I know you want to ask me the question, is he the best player I've ever represented? Carlos Queiroz can answer that question for me. He said, Mabizela was good enough to play in any team anywhere in the world, including Real Madrid. And don't forget, Queiroz coached Real Madrid. So, a sad, sad story. Wonderful character. I loved him as a son, and I mean that sincerely. Often people said, why did we stay together for so long? Because he was part of our family. I often say, you can have 6 children, and one might be the one that gives you the biggest heartache. What do? Do you close your door on that child, or do you embrace that kid with the same and possibly even more love than you would the other 5? And great character, unbelievable footballer. Who knows what he might have achieved.
Mike, just in closing, might be a little bit of an emotional note for you. And you talk about the fact that the players that you represent are like family to you. So it's a whole big family in pro sports. And just talk to us about the difficulty of when you hear of a passing of a player. And I go back to the likes of Senzo Meyaza, which is probably the most recent one that hits a lot of us, even as media, spectators, people in South African football. And there are also other players. You also mentioned Leslie Manyatela in that.
If I can interrupt you, can mention a few others. Gift Laramie.
If they're in, yes.
Recently,
Anele
Madisha, Anele Tunga. So it, and I'm going to appeal to South African footballers to take care of their lives, because you have so many examples, both good and tough examples to follow. Senzo Meyaza, how did I feel? Gosh. First and foremost, Senzo played in the same KZN junior teams as my son Michael. So he was the goalkeeper. Michael was a midfielder. And so there was already a bond between myself and Senzo. And then we started looking after Senzo just before he was called into Pirates' pro ranks. It was with the development team. So the evening that I received a call from our regional manager in Gauteng, Kolani Ntleko, to tell me that Senzo was fighting for his life in hospital, it was that feeling that you get that it can't be true, that numb feeling that I had felt when I was told about Leslie. And you hope and pray that it has a good outcome. Fortunately, in Senzo's case, it didn't have that outcome. So we were robbed of, again, an enormous character, great character, only starting to hit his straps in his career. Wonderful charisma, outspoken, and unbelievable goalkeeper. Him and Kune were the two gems that we had as goalkeepers in those days. They were the gems amongst many other gems. So it was sad, very, very sad.
And I think at that time, like you said, he was at the peak of his powers. I mean, he was named the captain of Bafana at that time. And Mike,
he was a hero in Lubumbashi. A big hero.
A big hero. And Mike, I mean, last week it marked 7 years since the passing of Senzo Meyaza, and 7 years later, there's no information from the authorities in terms of what really happened. The case is not making any progress, and I think that's the saddest part for everyone.
I think the saddest part for his family, more than anyone else. You know, I can imagine the grief they felt and still feel, because I still feel sad. But you can imagine that's their flesh and blood. Sad because on a global scale, we have so many cold cases. Some which we believe should be solved, and some which aren't solved for valid reasons, because they just can't solve them. We have to hope and pray that our justice system isn't letting Senzo and his family down. We have to pray that eventually something will break in the case and the perpetrator or perpetrators will be brought to justice. It's about time it happens.
It's about time. It's long overdue.
It's long overdue.
And I think we'll have to leave it on that emotional note, Mike.
Yeah.
I think you're a fountain of knowledge when it comes to South African football, and it was really a great conversation to have today. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise as well.
Thank you to Marshall's World of Sport for being so innovative and intuitive with this podcast. I'm sure it's going to be something that we're all going to be looking forward to going forward. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Mike. And of course, we're going to leave it here for today from myself, Aaron Danusa, and Marshall's World of Sports team. It is bye for now.